In late June, most of the division loaded up on LSTs for the operation against Munda airfield. A few days later, my father's unit loaded up on a couple of LCIs, landing craft infantry, for the trip up to Rendova, the staging island just across and about 5 miles from Munda airfield. The division landed on Rendova, which you can see in the lower left, as a staging area. The artillery moved over to a little island called Sassavel, just off the coast of Munda. The artillery, my father's artillery, sat there and sent shells over to support the infantry that had landed to the east of Munda field and was driving the 5 miles through the jungle for about 3 weeks or a full month to finally capture Munda airfield. As this story unfolds, you will learn that after the Munda field was captured, there was more fighting on Baanga, which is a little island west of Munda, and then further north, Arundel Island. The mosaic you see here is the same map you see, but a beautiful, full-size, several feet across, maybe 4 or 5 feet, mosaic, which I found in the U.S. National Cemetery in Manila, where the bodies of many, if not all, of the dead from the Pacific area are now buried. By the time they went into this combat, my father was commanding officer of a field artillery battalion, of about 600 men and 25 officers, and their main purpose of existence was to fire accurately these 12 howitzers of 105 millimeter diameter. About 4-inch shells is what they fired. It was a rather technical kind of activity. Well, as my father on the LCI entered Rendova Harbor, getting ready for this big operation, their first time in serious combat, and it's already 1943, they've been in the service 2.5 years now, and unbeknownst to him, he's about, within the next hour of writing this, to experience an event that could have wiped him out for the war, even before their first shot was fired. This is a July 4th letter, the beginning of the letter that I read to you at the beginning of this talk. Can you imagine I would ever celebrate the 4th of July on a boat? We are waiting to unload now, and I have been waiting for 3 hours. This is a lovely little harbor with little coconut plantations on parts of the shore. Back inland, the mountains tower into the clouds. Nearby, our artillery is firing on the enemy installations across from us. We have not yet been committed, and the men are thrilled to hear their sister unit firing in battle. This is the howitzers, big artillery howitzers firing. There are a lot of questions such as, are they really firing at the Japs? They can hardly believe that they have finally reached this phase. This is, of course, all old to you by the time you receive it, for the radio has been announcing things in great detail. You will note the little indented harbor up in the upper right-hand corner of this slide. That's where his LCI ships were about to land to unload the men. The entrance to the harbor on the left is where they had previously entered. Well, back home, as he's entering this combat in July 1943, my mother is 6 months pregnant, still is keeping the pregnancy a secret from all of her family and friends. And she arranged to send Valerie and me to summer camps and then on to boarding schools in the following fall, so we would never have to know that she was pregnant. She went to Baltimore and we were led to believe that she was sick and had to spend some time in a hospital. My father somehow got the idea she was doing war work. She was very lonely. She told me at one time she could not even tell her closest sister the terrible trouble she was in. And in the 40s, it was terrible trouble. Certainly, she was sort of a feminist. I mean, she was a writer, she was a pianist, near professional in both cases. Went to New York City, and this pregnancy really put a stop to that. She did not this year have her piano with her. It was in storage. That piano had been bought in 1938, and she's been with that piano every year of her life since then until even now, It's with her in Florida. And that one year was the only year that she did not have it. Well, the LCIs went into that beach and they offloaded the men. And my father, they no sooner got on the phone and reported that they were there than the generals told them to get back on the LCIs and go back off onto one of those little offshore islands, because I believe it was so the supply situation with supplies were piling up on that beach and it was a confused mess. My father went back to catch that LCI just as it was leaving, jumped across the adjacent LCI, and then onto the one he'd been on. And he went up to the skipper. The skipper, he wrote, was a young Navy lieutenant from Richmond, Virginia, named Tompkins. He was a bit upset and said he would have to get an okay from the Commodore to take my men back on board. They're still, by the way, right next to the beach. I gave a few generals as my authorities, so he started to signal to the Commodore about my problems. The answer was wait. So we did, and soon found out why. Just then, from 16 to 24 Jap bombers, MiG-97s, came over us. They were in formation and were like beautiful silver birds. I could see when they dropped their bombs way up high and noticed how the sun glinted on them as they fell. They looked like little drops of mercury. At first I stood on the deck and I thought about a slit trench for me, but they had forgotten to dig any in the deck. Next I considered jumping in the water, but decided that was a bad place to be too. All this time, about 1 second, those lovely little shiny bombs were sliding down a steep curve toward the ground. I was quite concerned that they appeared to be headed for our infantry nearby and was wishing them all luck possible. However, an instant later, I decided they would land on my troops. I was scared to death then at the thought of all those men. My father's alone on this ship. His troops are all on the beach. Of DeBlois' baby, I was thinking of DeBlois' baby he has never seen. She, by the way, lives 4 blocks from where I sit here in Washington. Right now. Of the girl Farrell couldn't get leave to marry. Of Keegan the reliable. Of Green the Texas lawyer. Of Swan and others. I don't know how long those bombs took to fall, but I did a lot of thinking while they did. About that time, it suddenly dawned on me that I was in the wrong place so far as the bombs were concerned. So your old man decided to get off the hatch cover he had been sitting on and very efficiently lay down on the deck against a steel bulkhead. The next thing I knew, the hatch cover went bye-bye and I found I was okay. It got blown 100 feet in the air, according to the skipper. The first bomb had landed on the other side of my batteries, his men, his artillery howitzers. The second one alongside my LCI less than 8 feet from me, and the others dropped in the harbor. You can see on the map the little bomb pattern laid out. By this time, the bombers looked like very disorganized, and I was told all were shot down before they cleared the harbor. After it was all over, I asked the skipper, what about getting on about our business? He said, hell, we're sunk. I looked down the hatch and saw it was all torn to pieces inside and half full of water. The ship I had climbed on, too, was also full of holes end down. It seems I hold a record for this outfit, that of having a ship sunk under me in 10 feet of water. I was the only casualty in my battalion, and it has worked out well because I came wading out of the ocean with a bloody head and later a bandage that made me look like Captain Kidd, and went ahead about my business. Mainly, I needed to keep going because of the tendency to be shaky. That injury bothered him for the next 4 years. It has paid good dividends, though, because the men have studied a lot. One of the finest compliments I ever received was when one corporal rather shamefacedly said, the men wanted me to know that after I was as calm as I had been, they would not worry any more about anything. He was a bit confused, but I was very flattered. They have no idea how scared I really was. He went ashore with the blood streaming down his forehead, waded ashore, that is, and attended to the muddy Rendova. He attended to the business of getting his battalion, the howitzers and the ammunition, a back-breaking job, set up on the little offshore island of Sassaville. The infantry landed on the nothing beach of Zanana and went ashore about 5 miles behind Munda. My father went with them so he could better see to the needs of the infantry. In other words, make sure his artillery would better do what they might desperately need in certain circumstances. It was unusual. I think he also liked to be near the combat. It was unusual for a senior artillery officer to do this. He worked hard. His unit did well. Some of the infantry units had a difficult time of it. Some of the infantry soldiers became terribly demoralized in those foxholes in the middle of the night. There were stories of Americans knifing Americans because they thought they were Japanese, of grenades getting thrown at imaginary noises, or at real noises, real jungle noises, but not Japanese, and bouncing off trees and coming back and injuring Americans. That unit was pulled out of the line for a short period. Its commander was relieved. The commander of the division was relieved as the attack sort of bogged down in the face of this jungle warfare and the Japanese resistance. It was slow, it was confusing. During this period, my father's howitzers fired day and night, supporting the infantry. The empty shell cases made an impressive sight. Phone lines between the front lines and the artillery had to be laid. They were broken. They had to be repaired and relayed again. Heroes did that. He describes the Fire Direction Control Center, which is the nerve center for his battalion, which was situated near the howitzers back on the little offshore island, 5 miles from the front lines. And as he wrote it to Valerie, about the very scene you see here. By the way, right now I'm down in our Fire Direction Control Center dugout. We have electric lights here. On the walls are maps and photographs and charts on tables, all used to put the fire of the battalion on the right spot in the front lines. I used to sit up in the front lines and decide where to shoot and pick out the spot on the ground and map. Then I'd phone or radio to Major DeBlois, where, when, and how much, meaning how much firing we needed, and that's Major DeBlois sitting on the left with a telephone to his ear. He would do some calculating. His computers, the men in the background with the computers, would do some figuring and issue orders to their batteries. Next, Major DeBlois would say quietly, fire. And on the phone to me, he would say, on the way, Bill, meaning the shells are on the way up to where you are. In about half a minute, I would hear the noise of the guns come booming across the jungle for 5 miles. And an instant later, my shells would whisper, whish, whish, hurry, hurry, whish, whish, hurry, over my head. And I would say into the phone, they passed here going the right way, all right? I think he made that up for this letter. DeBlois would say, get your head down, that ain't all. And here would come some more. One day he sent out over 2,500 shells, and altogether we sent out 28,975 during the whole Munda battle. Since each one weighed 50 pounds, you can calculate how much they weighed in pounds and tons. He wrote this to Valerie, who was 12 at the time. Anyway, after we heard them over our heads, we would almost at once hear the blast and roaring crash of the shells exploding in our next-door neighbor's front yard. Sometimes we put them in his backyard, sometimes in his side yard, and even in his lap. The hole that you just saw, the hole in the ground, was in this garden, which is now in the village, a small village of Sassaville. The remnants of the war, like this truck, are still there, as are beautiful children. I was like the Pied Piper walking through that village with 20 or 30 or 40 children following us, and the forward ones alongside us jockeying to be next to me. Life with the infantry was not very pleasant. Dad went a hectic 3 weeks with little sleep, no clothes changes, no baths or shaves. The jump-off point for the attack was the Bariki River, where you see me in this picture. I found the so-called Munda Trail, the road from Zanana up to Munda, which was built as the division proceeded, to be pleasant, refreshing, with dappled sunlight and cool pools. However, I did not sleep out overnight in holes with several inches of warm water, malarial mosquitoes, and land crabs. As he wrote, also a few nights ago, I was sleeping in my hole and a big land crab with a body as big as the palm of my hand crawled across my chest. I knocked him off onto Captain Goff's feet, and he gave it a kick clear out of the hole. It was very dark and we couldn't see a thing, but we heard it land, and then some soldier in that direction made some very nasty cracks about whoever had thrown a crab on him. Goff and I lay there and nearly burst to keep from laughing out loud. I guess it wasn't very dignified for the major to be kicking crabs around. His forward observers, like Lieutenant Mushik you see here, were heroic young officers who stayed up with the infantry on the front lines and would put their heads up to see where the artillery shells landed and would telephone back the corrections to the fire direction center you just saw. He wrote to me, "You would like one of my officers, Hale." He's writing to me, Hale. "You would like one of my officers named Don Mushik. He is a first lieutenant. He worked for about 2 weeks conducting our fires from a hill that the Japs could both see and shoot to. Day after day while he was talking over the telephone, I would suddenly hear a loud crash on the phone. Then he would say, 'Jiminy,' and there would be silence for a while. Then he would be back saying, 200 left, 100 over, which means the last volley we fired was 200 yards left and 100 yards beyond where we wanted the next one to fall. I would guess he was shot at 150 times a day, sometimes by rifles, sometimes by mortars, and occasionally by a high-velocity dual-purpose gun. He was wounded in the arm and did not tell me. I was told, though, and sent him back to the rear to have it dressed and to get a rest. 2 days later, I sent for him again, and he went back on his hill. Since then, he has stayed with the infantry with some of my other officers during their last advance, which cleared out the Japs. I am going to recommend him for a decoration." Mushik was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, second only in prestige to the Congressional Medal of Honor. He now lives in Bismarck, North Dakota. Two of my father's forward observers, Lieutenants Earl Payne and Arthur Malone, were killed. He commented that Payne's death bothered him the most because Payne had a son about my age. It wasn't happy for the Japanese either. Two of his Washington State friends were killed. Two other divisions had been brought in to make the final attack with the 43rd Division, one of which was his old unit from Washington State. Chris was killed by a short American mortar round that wounded him, and he bled to death in the aid station. Another, Lieutenant French, with 2 enlisted men, was behind a U.S. tank in that attack, which backed up and ran over him and the 2 enlisted men. My father never mentioned that it wasn't Japanese that killed his friends, simply wrote that 2 of his friends were killed. On the hill where they were killed, there is now, or when there was when I was there, a scarecrow put up in a garden, put up there by one of the natives. It was a burlap stretched across some poles and a rusted out old GI helmet that they had found in the jungles of that hill. This picture, I think, tells it all. On August 5th, 1943, Munda airfield was captured by the Americans, the objective of all of this miserable campaign. It was in May 1983 that I landed on this mythical airfield, an experience I could not believe was happening to me. I'd been hearing about this airfield for 40 years. Dad summed up his feelings about that 1 month of sleepless effort. It was fascinating, strenuous, and sometimes exciting. Because of my having stayed up front in spite of 2 excuses for getting back, I am in a very enviable position in the battalion.
Sleeps a man remembered well. time for glory in the infantry. No, they've got no time for praises loudly sung. But in every soldier's heart, in all the infantry, shines the name of Roger Young. Shines the name, Roger Young. Fought and died for the men he marched among. To the everlasting glory of the infantry.
There was to be no reorganization. 1 week after the capture of Munda airfield, on 12 August, 2 landing craft attempted to land on the adjacent little island of Baanga, just a quarter mile across the water from Munda. The 100 men, the 2 landing craft were ambushed by the Japanese as they attempted to land on this small beach. A number of men, some 20 to 40, were stranded on the beach, and the boats withdrew. It took 2 regiments a week to secure the island and rescue the few survivors. In this map, you can see the cove and the beach, the cove where the men went in. You can see Munda airfield off to the right. You can see the naval guns I'm going to talk about shortly, where they were on the tip of the island, the southern tip of the island off to the left. The whole Baanga campaign, as my father wrote, was a depressing and unfortunate affair in many ways. He never wrote it up. He was in charge of the artillery and lost yet another forward observer, as he wrote 6 weeks later. Another item, less pleasant, had to do with Lieutenant Heidelberger, whom we lost in Baanga. It has just been ruled that he was killed in action. He was seriously wounded, and we carried him as missing. A body was found and partially identified as his. I still hope he will show up as a prisoner of war, but the chances are poor. 4 days later, he wrote, "Today I wrote to Mrs. Heidelberger of Utica, New York, about her son Bert, who was a first lieutenant in this battalion. He was missing in action and had been so reported until we had all the available facts collected. Then he was reported killed in action." Excuse me. It was a hard letter to write because I could say so little that would be a comfort to her. He was a fine boy who had done a wonderful job everywhere he worked. When the Japs got him, they really hurt the battalion. I couldn't even tell her he had gone easily because he had traveled a long way through Jap territory after being wounded, but all of it the wrong way. It was a pity that such a dogged determination to live was defeated by a loss of direction. When I got in touch with his brother did not know this story and had a hard time believing it because he was such a good, he really knew the woods and did a lot of hunting. Anyway, my father goes on, I told her how much we liked Bert and that I was with him at noon of his last day and some of the things he did that saved the lives of many American soldiers. Today he's buried in the beautiful U.S. National Cemetery in Manila. There was one rewarding aspect to the Baanga operation in my dad's eyes, and that was the expeditious destruction of 2 large, hidden Japanese naval guns that were firing on Munda airfield from the southern tip of Baanga, Munda now being a U.S. airfield. It was about 5 in the morning, he wrote to me, and we woke up saying, "That firing doesn't sound like ours." We jumped out of our foxhole and ran down to the beach and saw the flashes from these guns over on Baanga. He had started too early and it was dark enough to let his flashes show. In other words, he could see where the guns were. I grabbed the phone and said in it, now he's doing this giving orders to the artillery batteries he had control of then, and it so happened the artillery was already registered in that vicinity, so he could bring the fire to bear very fast. And so I said in it, 907, 10 volleys, then to another battalion, 905 is 200 right, 500 short, fire at will. In 4 minutes, the Jap guns were through for this war. See how the shells have knocked the tops of the trees off. In this picture, you can see how the Japs took the breech block away and also the sight. I had that gun sight for a souvenir for many, many years, a small telescope. This was a significant technical accomplishment in which he took pride. The next day, when he visited the site, and this is him you see in the picture, he allowed himself only a mention of the unmarked Japanese bodies, the unmarked bodies found huddled in nearby shelters, killed by the shock waves of his furious artillery bombardment. It was on this visit to the nearby captured areas of Baanga that he found and sent home some material found in a Japanese camp. I'm enclosing a few papers I found. Note the touching child's crayon work and the family aspect. I send it so the children will see these are people too with homes and children. They must realize they are wrong because they have the wrong government policies, not because they are Japs. This is in contrast to the not infrequent sort of unfeeling and insensitive or even brutal comments he often makes about the killing of Japanese by his own artillery or by other means. Upon my arrival at Munda airfield, I asked if the guns were still on Baanga and was told yes, one of them. My guide was Alfred Basili, who had been a scout for the 43rd Division. He took me in his 30-foot canoe with a 25-horse outboard motor, and we were soon there. Here you see the base of the gun with me standing beside it. You'll note I'm in clothes that protect me a little more than in the previous picture. But this was my first day there, and I was a little nervous about mosquitoes. And the previous picture was taken a day or two later when I had discovered the wonderful, how Caribbean-like and holiday-like the Solomons can be, and had begun to relax a bit. Here you see the barrel of the gun. Notice it stretches way to the barrel of the gun on the ground. It stretches way to the top of the picture, and also a recoil spring. In fact, I found both guns were there, the two guns were there, both with their barrels lying on the ground.
On the island of New Georgia in the Solomons stands a simple wooden cross alone to tell. Beneath a silent coral in the Solomons sleeps a man